All right, now there are a couple of things that I want to look at to get the roof, all of these different pieces that have different geometry, to plane in. So the key thing with roofs is imagine not these individual rafters and trim pieces as being separate. You want to think about them as creating a plane. And the plane is on the top of the roof. And so you want these planes to be flat, and you want them to meet exactly on the hips and in the center of the ridge. And I go into this in another screencast in more depth. But what we're going to look at are a couple of places where it's important to plane in. So the first place is where the hip meets up. So notice the way we're framing our hip roofs. We've got a ridge and a common and a common, and there's a common on this other side. I'll rotate around just a little bit. So we've got a common here, and a common here, and a common here. They are identical. And then the hips get wedged in between those. And notice the hip has a point on it. And then what I want to focus on right here is notice when you go to install the hip. So this has nothing to do with your layout or your calculations. You've already subtracted for reality, and we'll talk about that in another video. But what I'm looking at is notice that I'm not worried about the point lining up with the ridge. I'm interested in the right edge planing in with this side of the roof, and the left edge planing in with this side of the roof. So this entirely applies when you are nailing these hips in, that you just use your eyeball or your speed square or your hand, and you just flush that side and that side to the commons on either side of that hip, and that's the proper location up at the ridge for the hip to be installed. Same thing over here. We orbit around a little bit. It's the same issue here. We've got a common and a common. That makes the square in the corner. We've got our hip coming out at exactly 45-degree angle, and we want this edge to plane in with that common and this edge to plane in with that common. So again, this has nothing to do with your calculations or your layout. This entirely has to do with when it comes time to just nail that hip in place. This is your reference up here, and I've got this little stick right up here. That's actually the center. That's the theoretical line right up there. Again, we'll talk about that in another video. Then the other place that's important to plane in is down here where the fascia. So we've got our fascia, and we've got our rafters. And I'll orbit around just a little bit so you can see what we're talking about. And notice, it looks like this is hung too low. But in reality, this is the correct installation because we care about the plane. So if I'm just going to project this level down, it should just touch the outside of the fascia. So again, if you're thinking like a sheet of plywood, your plywood would need to come all the way down the slope of the roof and rest on that fascia. And it's fine to have a little air in there. I mean, this ends up being not very much space. It's like a ½ inch or so. But this is crucial. You're not thinking about flushing the tops of everything, the individual parts. You're thinking about the overall roof plane. So this is something when you're installing your fascia, it's common to have a straight edge or your speed square projecting down the rafter, and then you just butt your fascia up into it. So this is a really common solution. Nobody sees this once the sheathing goes on. This is entirely hidden. You just have a little air gap. The other solution is when you cut your fascia, you would piece it in, and your fascia would actually be, you wouldn't piece it in, you would bevel the top. But think about that. That's a skill saw cut. And these are probably 20-foot long pieces. You certainly could do that, maybe if you had a table saw on site to make the cut, but typically that's a skill saw cut. Just having the fascia installed at the correct elevation takes care of any kind of problem. So you want to think about the top roof plane and how everything planes in. You're not necessarily worried about flushing the actual tops of things to each other.